Welcome to ILTV Security Brief. I'm Kalev Ben David. Each week, we focus on the latest developments in security and defense relating to Israel and the Middle East, impacting on this region and beyond. And we start with our top items of the past week. The IDF launches airstrikes on targets in Damascus and a Syrian military convoy as it approaches the southern city of Sueda, where dozens of Druze have been killed in sectarian violence. Druze from Israel and Syria breached the Golan border in both directions, as the U.S. calls for all sides to de-escalate during a ceasefire between the Damascus regime and Syrian Druze. Israel launches airstrikes in East Lebanon, with the IDF saying it targeted operatives and military infrastructure from Hezbollah's elite Radwan unit, trying to reestablish a stronghold in the Bekaa Valley. Lebanese sources say 12 people were killed in the strikes, which Hezbollah calls a major provocation. U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee calls on Israel to aggressively investigate the murder of Saif Musalat, a 20-year-old Palestinian-American whose body was found beaten to death in the village of Sinjil near Ramallah last week. The incident comes amid rising violence in recent months between Palestinian and Israeli residents in Judea and Samaria. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei threatens an even bigger blow against the U.S. than last month's attack on the American military base in Qatar, after President Trump said he is in no rush to talk with the Tehran regime. This as the EU says it will reinstate sanctions against Iran lifted a decade ago if it does not take steps to limit its nuclear program. And now our main story. The overthrow of the Assad regime and its replacement by a government that shares some common enemies with Israel initially opened up new possibilities of establishing ties between Jerusalem and Damascus. But that optimism has been tempered by concerns over the growing sectarian violence in Syria perpetrated by Islamist jihadists, some allied with the ruling authorities, directed against the Druze and Christian communities. This week, that situation exploded with the IDF launching unprecedented airstrikes on Syrian military headquarters in the presidential palace in Damascus, and at a government military convoy headed for the village of Sueda, where dozens of Druze have been killed in ethnic clashes. That fighting also sparked chaos on the Golan border, with hundreds of Israeli Druze crossing into Syria to aid their brethren. Syrian President Ahmed Al-Shaara, under pressure from the U.S., condemned the attacks on the Druze and announced a ceasefire during which government forces would pull back from Sueda. Here's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu explaining why Israel took action in Syria.
אנחנו פועלים גם בסוריה היום, מהבוקר. יש לנו מחויבות לשמור על אזור דרום-מערב סוריה כשטח מפורז בגבול ישראל. אנחנו לא נרשה לחזור למצב שמקיימים לנו שם לבנון שנייה. ואנחנו גם מחויבים לשמור על התושבים הדרוזים. אנחנו עושים זאת באמצעות פעולות עצימות.
And for more, we are joined by Reserves Brigadier General Amir Avivi. He's the founder and chairman of the Israel Defense and Security Forum. Amir, thank you so much for joining us.
How are you?
Let me just ask you about this Israeli actions that were taken, striking the military headquarters in Damascus and those convoys. Was this the right course for Israel to do? Did it achieve what Israel wanted to?
If Israel attacked the regime, this means that Israel has the intelligence that the regime is the one that mobilized those terrorists into the Druze area and conducted this massacre. And this is why it's the right thing to do, to attack the regime and send a crystal clear message. We are not going to allow this regime to attack the Druze. We're not going to allow a massacre, and we're not going to allow them to move militants south of Damascus into the area of the Golan Heights.
Right. Well, since you say that the Syrian government was complicit in these attacks on the Druze, that does raise the question of whether President Ahmed Al-Shaara can be trusted when he talks about trying to moderate those jihadist elements. Or even if he were sincere, does he even have the authority or ability to control them and control Syria now? What's your take?
So he's not really controlling Syria. You have 50% of Syria in the hand of the Kurds. You have areas that are controlled by the Alawis. You have areas that are controlled by the Druze. And Al-Shaara is conducting a brutal ethnic cleansing. In the shores on the Alawis, he's trying to do ethnic cleansing with the Druze. He's attacking also the Kurds. The basic ideology is a radical Sunni Islamic ideology. I don't know what will happen in the future, even inside these Sunni elements, who will take over. There are many who see his tendency to get closer to the West as not the right policy to pursue for such a kind of ideology. So things are not stable. And the big question is, what is our vision? What do we want in Syria? So if we go back 100 years ago, the French, when they took over this area, they created 6 states. One of them became Lebanon, but also the Druze, they were a state. From 1921 all the way to 1936, they were a state called Jabal Druze. Now, does Israel want Syria to become one state? Do we want to have a Druze state that will serve as a buffer zone? You know, in 1967, at the end of the war, Yigal Allon set a vision. He said we should create an autonomous Druze area that will work with Israel and create the buffer zone. We're in the same discussion now. It was right 100 years ago. It was also discussed in 1967, and now once again, we're discussing whether we need an alliance and creating a state or a Druze autonomy, and we need to take a decision. What do we want? Do we want a unified Syria headed by this murderous regime, but maybe joining the Abraham Accords, as President Trump is hoping? Or we say this is not going to work. These guys, you know, ideologically, they're not going to become democratic or Western, and we better disintegrate Syria, make sure it stays like that, and ally ourselves with the Druze.
All right, well, that may be a strategy for Israel, but of course it would require the international community coming aboard, and we know they have a different view from Israel. And as you mentioned itself, even President Trump, who very quickly lifted the sanctions on Syria, who met with President Al-Shaara and seems to, at this stage, be trusting him. So part of the problem for Israel right now is it seems it's not on the same page as the U.S.
It's true. But I think that we need to show to the U.S. the atrocities this regime is doing, the ethnic cleansing that they are conducting, and understand who we are dealing with.
Right, we should mention Christian elements in Syria also. Communities have been under attack.
Yeah, definitely. And also Christian communities, right? Yeah.
But do you think the U.S. will go along? Because there are other considerations for the U.S. For example, the relationship between the U.S. and Turkey, which is the main backer of the Al-Shaara regime.
So I think that even if you move towards a unified Syria, you can push towards an idea of autonomous areas that have a large autonomy within this constellation. So we really need to discuss
such as in Iraq.
Exactly, such as in Iraq. That's a good example. So we can push towards this kind of solution. But of course, I believe that this will be relevant if indeed Al-Shaara is willing to join the Abraham Accords and normalize relations with Israel and recognize Israel. And we'll see if this happens.
Right, and you discussed the security implications for Israel. There are certainly those in the Druze community in Israel and others who also say there is a sense of moral obligation to the Druze community, which we note as have been loyal citizens of the state, have served in senior positions in the army and in government. What is the obligation of Israel to the Druze, not just here in Israel, but some of them have close families there in Syria?
So I think that for the Israeli Jewish community, what's happening in Syria, it's a very sensitive issue. This is their families that are being butchered. And they want to see Israel really giving an umbrella to the Jewish community in Syria. Our first obligation is to Israel's security. But here we have 2 different interests that combine. One is securing Israel, and for securing Israel in Syria without bringing many, many Israeli soldiers into Syria itself, allying ourselves with the Druze, it's a good solution. So it will work well for the Israeli Jewish community who wants to see Israel really assisting the Druze. And of course, it will work also well for our security. We need this alliance with the Druze to keep the other forces away and north of Damascus. We need to work with them together. Israel as a regional power needs to learn how to work with our other powers and not only use Israeli soldiers wherever they want to push some security policy.
All right. Well, complicated situation, and we'll see how the government navigates this. Amir, I'm going to ask you to stay with us. We're going to move, of course, to another key topic, and of course, that is the situation with Gaza. It was another tense week of waiting for the families of the hostages to see if Israel and Hamas would finally arrive to terms on a deal that would at last free some of those remaining captives being held in Gaza. Now, Israel and Hamas are reportedly close to an agreement, narrowing differences on the scope of an IDF pullback during a 60-day ceasefire. But there are those who strongly object to a deal that reportedly would only free half of the remaining 20 living hostages. And the key sticking point remains whether a 2-month truce should lead to an end to the war, with disagreements remaining on such key issues as the disarming of Hamas and expulsion of her leaders. Also, how Gaza should be rebuilt and ruled after the fighting stops, and what to do with its Palestinian population during that period. Now, our reporter, Shosh Brajosian, was in Gaza today with the IDF, and she joins us now from our news studio. Shosh, good to see you back. First of all, tell us about your experience today there in Gaza.
Well, the first thing that, of course, caught our eye were the massive explosions that took place in northern Gaza. We know from what the IDF has actually released in terms of information within the past few days that they have been continuing to target infrastructure when it comes to tunnel routes, weapons caches. And once we were inside, you know, that information was starting to make sense of what they were telling us, not just because the video released, but because we were seeing it with our own eyes, Kalev. They were telling us that the explosions that we were seeing, that we were hearing in the background, they were targeting most likely underground locations such as tunnels and places where these weapons were stored. They say that they continue to clear the buildings because it's incredibly devastated in that area, but it is destroyed because they are trying to make sure no terrorists, Hamas terrorists, are still in that area. They did tell us today that there is combat, you know, face-to-face fighting from time to time, where terrorists kind of linger until they decide to ambush these IDF soldiers.
Right, and tell us about some of your encounters with the soldiers there who are performing under such really difficult conditions.
Yeah, the morale was very, very high, which is quite impressive. I will say it was fascinating to see, you know, where they have set up shop, where they do and conduct their operations, but it's really a lookout point. We were able to see Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, and see kind of what they see in their perspective in terms of having to continue this war as Hamas continues to linger. Hamas continues to be in that area. One of the commanders we spoke with actually called those two cities we oversaw today Hamas strongholds, and these are areas they're continuing to hit. Even though it looks decimated, they say that these terrorists continue to still linger, continues to still operate, but he told me they remain defiant that they will stay there until these terrorists are gone.
All right, we should mention, Shosh, our viewers could see your full report on our daily news show on ILTV. Thank you for joining us on Security Brief.
Thanks, Kalev.
And let's get back to our guest now, Amir Avivi. And Amir, we heard about the situation in Gaza. Clearly, the Hamas threat is still there. There's still fighting going on. And yet, we're on the verge, potentially, of a 60-day ceasefire, which will include an IDF pullback. I want to get your view on what would that mean for the military effort in Gaza?
So at this stage, before the ceasefire, the army got a mission to conquer 75% of the Gaza Strip. The army has conquered 75%, and it's now clearing it. What Shosh described is exactly what's going on. The army is completely clearing all the infrastructure, all the terrorists in those 75%. So Gaza now became 25%, and the 75% are on the verge of being completely cleaned, as we did in Rafah. You see that in Rafah, we don't hear about any terror attacks. Why? It was completely cleared. The same is happening in Beit Hanun, in Jibalia, in Sajaiya.
Why wasn't the IDF able to do this in those areas in northern Gaza earlier in the war, in the fighting?
Very simple, because it's the first time in the last few months that they got the mission to conquer, not to raid. When you raid, you go in and out, the enemy retreats and then goes back. And in a raid, you cannot really systematically deal with all the infrastructure. It's going in and out. And now it's conquering, it's going in, staying, not leaving, and then systematically destroying all the terror infrastructure. It takes time, and this is why you also have fighting from time to time when the terrorists emerge from some tunnel that finally the soldiers detected and want to destroy. This is the kind of warfare we're dealing with now. Now, we predicted that when we'll hold 75% of Gaza, this will put Hamas in enough pressure to want to have a ceasefire and then be willing to release hostages. And we might be at this point. The problem is that there is no real command and control today in Gaza. Hamas is scattered. You have pockets of resistance, and the decision-making is done in Qatar. Now, these guys are sitting in 5-star hotel. They're not feeling the pressure. They're not fighting. And therefore, it's easier for them to say, we are not agreeing to a deal. So the question is, what do we do? And at a certain point, there needs to be also a pressure on Hamas that is in Qatar. One of the things we suggested in IDSF is pushing a policy in which the U.S. will demand the extradition of these terrorists to the U.S. They killed Americans. They kidnapped Americans. If we will arrest the leadership of Hamas, the remaining leadership, they're all in Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey, and then throw them into the dungeon, that's a good way to put pressure to make sure they release all the hostages. So we need to think out of the box, because at the moment we're doing the same things we did before. It's not bringing yet a hostage deal. If it doesn't, we need to change completely the way we're doing things, go after them, arrest them, and then we'll have real leverage on the leadership in order to release hostages. Now, there is two ways of looking at the hostage issue. One group says there are 20 hostages alive. We need to go in strongly, destroy the remaining leadership of Hamas, and negotiate on the houses themselves, in the neighborhoods, with the guys that are holding them, negotiate a hostage deal, not with Qatar, with with the militants on the ground. Simultaneously, on all 20 guys that are being held by Hamas. That's one way of looking at it. It has its opportunities, but also a big danger.
A big risk for the hostages.
It's a big risk, but it's also an opportunity, because doing a deal that is only half of the hostages, on one hand, will bring safely half of the hostages. On the other hand, 10 hostages will remain for sure for 2 months and probably much more, and will be in a grave danger. So it's a dilemma. I don't think there is a right or wrong answer. I mean, it's managing risk. And we also have to remember that when you do 60 days of ceasefire, the other kind of risk, you retreat, the soldiers will be in risk. So it's a very, very complex reality. But I think that the decision was taken in the government and also in the US. We are pushing towards a 60-day ceasefire to get half of the hostages. And following that, we'll have to work out, what will be the next step in order to achieve all goals of war, to eradicate Hamas, to bring the remaining hostages, and to create the reality that never again there will be a terror army in Gaza.
Right, but the question is, during that 60-day ceasefire, there are supposed to be negotiations towards some kind of final agreement on a sort of post-Hamas Gaza. That is the complication of that. Hamas asking guarantees. How should Israel be approaching that once it goes into that 60-day period? What is the vision Israel should be promoting in terms of a day after in Gaza?
Israel's vision is crystal clear. There will be no Hamas the day after in Gaza. Now, there is two ways to achieve this. It's either Hamas lay down their weapons, give us the remaining hostages, and get out of Gaza alive, or they refuse to give the hostages, they refuse to lay down their weapons, and then Israel will move to the next stage, and that's the complete destruction of Hamas. And now the question is, are we mobilizing the Gazans to Rafah? The idea is to detach the Gazan society from Hamas, move them to an area of safety in Rafah, give them humanitarian aid in this area, and then if you move the society to Rafah and you give them aid there, and all the area remaining of Gaza, there is no Gazans, just Hamas, you can put a siege on all this area, and no water, no food. That's according to international law, that's just militants, it's not civilians, and then break Hamas through a siege or through a massive attack into Gaza City and other areas. And this is the strategies that are being discussed at the moment.
Right, but there's been, of course, criticism of that strategy internationally.
What's the problem to put a siege on terrorists? I mean, if you move the Gazans safely to Rafah, you move them to Rafah. What's the problem? Once they are in a safety area, which is exactly what the international law expects. The international law expects to enable citizens to move safely out of war zones to an area where they can get humanitarian aid and be safe, and they can be safe only in an area that the IDF controls, or Egypt opens the border and let them out. But if they're locked in Gaza, the only place they can be safe, it's in an area controlled by the IDF, where they can get humanitarian aid without it being robbed, without them being shot by Hamas. And the big question is more logistical. How do you manage a city of, 1 million plus Gazans in Rafah, and how do you manage all this humanitarian aid? It's a logistical issue more than another thing. But it can be done, and we can put a siege on the remaining parts of Gaza and bring down Hamas as a terror organization controlling what's left of Gaza, because 75% we are controlling at the moment.
Right, but beyond that then how is security handled in Gaza? Who takes control? There have been many different ideas floated about. It's some saying bringing in, for example, multinational force or Arab nations.
So I don't believe in multinational forces, certainly not managing security. The basic idea is that the overriding security responsibility will be Israeli, one way or another. The question is not the security, it's the everyday life. It's a civil side. And there will be two efforts. One is implementing Trump's plan of voluntary relocation, which Israel and the US are pushing strongly. Right. To fight countries that will be able to receive them. And the other thing is basing the everyday life on the local clans. Today, Rafah is controlled by a clan that is working with Israel. In Sajaiya, there is a clan already starting to work with Israel. So Israel is approaching the clans. As the more Hamas is destroyed, the more the clans get emboldened and understand that they can work with Israel towards a different reality. You ask me what will be Gaza? It will be cantonized. There will be areas controlled by different clans. Overriding security will be Israeli. And I must say that this model will probably be also very, very relevant for Judea and Samaria. Later on, we're already hearing about clans in Hebron who want to apply this model also.
A whole other big subject, which we don't have time for today, but on another occasion, perhaps. Amir Avivi, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
On ILTV Security Brief. And now a final word. This past Monday, a soldier in the IDF's Nachal Brigade serving in Israel's north took his own life. It was the fourth suicide among the IDF's ranks in just the past 2 weeks, part of a disturbing trend evident since the October 7th attack and the start of Israel's multi-front war in Gaza and elsewhere. Now, the exact figures are unconfirmed, since the IDF says it will only publish those next year. That response generated a public letter this week from 9 members of the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, which said, according to their information, there were 21 suspected suicides in the IDF in 2024 and 15 so far this year, a rise of 70% over the previous period last year, and a number which does not count attempted suicides, such as the latest incident reported just this week. Now, as that letter states, quoted, in a reality where IDF soldiers, both men and women, are under unprecedented mental strain, there is an urgent need to clarify the situation and ensure that all measures are taken to prevent the unnecessary loss of lives and soldiers who need support and assistance. It's no mystery as to the causes of this troubling trend: the stress on soldiers serving unprecedented periods in combat conditions in Gaza, on reservists called up for hundreds of days of duty, the grief over the mounting number of their comrades killed or injured in battle are clearly taking a mounting toll on the troops. In most dramatic cases, in instances of suicide, but many more in psychological stress leading to mental health issues, work accidents, and lowered morale. A report earlier this year cited that 12% of reservists who had fought in Gaza were reporting subsequent signs of PTSD, with medical professionals warning that Israel was facing a mental health crisis. The physical injuries from combat may be more obvious and dramatic, but its mental toll can be just as debilitating. The resources to aid soldiers dealing with these challenges must be allocated. The discussion over the problem must be frank and open, and Israeli society as a whole, every sector of it, must provide the sympathy and support needed by those serving in uniform. Loss of life on the battlefield is sometimes an unavoidable fact, of Israel having to defend itself from implacable enemies. But the loss of young men and women taking their own lives during and after their time in uniform is a pointless sacrifice that the IDF and all other relevant authorities must deem as an unacceptable and preventable tragedy. Thank you for joining us on ILTV Security Brief.